Good afternoon and welcome to Key Risk Indicators for Effective Strategy Management. Aligning risk management with business goals is critical when it comes to accomplishing an organization's strategic vision. Developing key risk indicators, or KRIs, can provide boards and leadership teams with proactive data to help achieve their objectives. In today's webinar, we'll talk about how to effectively create KRIs that improve your bank's approach to strategy management. We thank you for joining us. I'm Emily McCormick, the Vice President of Research at Bank Director, where I coordinate and execute research projects, including our annual surveys and ranking banking study. I also write for Bank Director Magazine and bankdirector.com. This webinar is brought to you by both Bank Director and Quantivate. Through our magazine and web content, events, and training programs, Bank Director focuses on the strategic issues most fundamental to bank executives and boards. Quantivate helps banks manage their governance, risk, and compliance initiatives, streamline risk and compliance processes to drive efficiency and strategic decisions. We're offering CPE, or Continuing Professional Education, credits for this webinar. In order to qualify for credits, you must be in attendance for the full and complete webinar, and you must participate in all 3 polls. If you want to receive CPE credit for this webinar, please email Kendall Kelly at kkelly@bankdirector.com. We'll send out certificates about 2 to 3 weeks following the webinar. So before we get going, let's just review a few housekeeping items. First off, don't worry, we can't hear you. You're in this webinar in listen-only mode. Also, we recommend that you click on the slide bar at the bottom of the screen to put the presentation into full screen mode. If you have questions for our speaker, please note them by clicking the Q&A button found on the right side of your screen. You can do this at any time during the presentation. Once our presenter has finished with his talking points, we'll have a Q&A period and we'll address the questions that have been asked. If you have any technical issues, you can also note those using the Q&A button, and we'll do our best to take care of it. Regarding our polls, which you'll need to take for CPE credit, those will appear in the sidebar near the Q&A button. When you've selected your answer, just hit the vote button to submit your response. There's no need to take detailed notes, as the presentation will be shared with all attendees within 24 hours via email. It will also be available on both bankdirector.com and quantivate.com. And finally, the opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the individual speaker only and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the other speakers or of the entities with which the speakers are associated. So with that, let me introduce our speaker. Bill Hoard is Vice President of Enterprise Risk Management Services at Quantivate. He has just shy of 30 years of experience as an executive in the financial services industry, where he's focused on a wide range of risk and compliance matters. Today, Bill consults with financial institutions and companies across the country to help them shape and build their risk management programs. Bill, I know you've got a lot of great information to share today, so please take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. And hello and welcome, everyone. Certainly want to say thank you for your attendance today, and absolutely want to say thank you to all the folks at Bank Director for allowing me to kind of bring this content to you. It is certainly an area that I get a lot of questions about when I work with my clients. It's definitely an area that is growing in terms of not only focus from the boards and executive teams, but also regulators looking at it as we begin to, our strategy begins to be a little bit more technical, a little bit more detailed, and in some cases, a little bit more risk as we tend to take on a little bit more to grow a little bit faster. And certainly the understanding the key risks to effective strategy implementation and then monitoring for those key risks is definitely an area where we start to see a lot of our clients wanting to not only mature, but continue to absolutely increase that maturation overall. So looking at the agenda today, going to talk to, like I always do, I like to cover topic definitions so that when I'm speaking about those throughout the presentation, we're all on the same page. Kind of a high-level strategic risk example that has happened in the past, and certainly there's going to be a lot we could probably reference over the last few years. We are going to talk about the development of the KRI. So kind of, what goes into it, show you a couple examples, high-level examples of some that I've actually worked with clients, give you kind of the background on that. And then also strategic objective, examples from the standpoint of, KRI opportunity. So a lot of people will refer to it as a reverse indicator or, a key opportunity indicator, but we're going to talk briefly about how they can potentially bring opportunities. And then, as Emily alluded to, we're going to have a Q&A. So hopefully, as we're going through, absolutely, put your questions in, and then Emily's going to field those questions at the end so that we can hopefully get them answered for you. So before we jump in, one of the things I always like to do is kind of, paint the picture, if you will. And I always ask, how much risk do you see? Because obviously, we've been managing risk since the beginning of our bank, and it's not that it's new to us. But the question becomes is how much risk do you actually see to make a risk-based business decision? And so when you look at this, you say, well, we've been managing credit risk from the get-go. That's absolutely true. And that kind of paints that picture, right? And we say, well, we fold in interest rate risk and we start to see, a little bit bigger picture. We manage liquidity risk. And again, we start to see, a broader picture to make our, our strategic business decisions around. And we also fold in compliance risk, obviously, in our line of work, heavily regulated. So compliance is in there. Now, this is typically what we'll see. Now, there are other risk categories that, that you're probably also looking at as well. But by and large, for the most part, these are kind of those core, if you will. And so a lot of times it's like we're basing, risk-based decisions around how we actually want to create and implement strategy based upon this picture right here. And the question really becomes is, okay, well, what about reputation risk? So, how much and what kind of reputation risk is actually going to be borne out in this strategy that we're developing and implementing? What about just the overall strategic risk as a whole, which we're going to be talking about here in a second? Transactional risk, so i.e. fraud and or errors. I mean, what are the key fraud or errors that this strategy brings to the bank? Certainly cyber. I mean, as we are, we've got more and more vendors that we're doing business with or seeking to do business with. We have more repository of data. We have more folks accessing that data, storing that data, transmitting that data. So in that particular aspect of your strategy, what's that true cyber risk? What are the key cyber risks? Of course, concentration is one that I was kind of talking about that you could easily throw over on the left-hand side of the screen because we're certainly cognizant of, concentration risk. But sometimes it's not just concentration risk around our loan portfolios or our investment portfolios. There could be other concentration risk based on the strategy, right? Operational risk. So what is that downstream impact? What are all those business processes potentially that are going to be impacted by it? And so when you look at the risk categories, right, that are applicable to your strategy, by doing so, you start to form, a much broader picture to base your business decisions on. And that's really that effective strategic management piece. Because at the end of the day, I would much rather, and most people when we talk about this slide, they would much rather base their business decision, on this picture than on this picture. And that's why I kind of bring it up as the point is that, just looking at the budgetary component, that technological component of our strategy is just simply not enough. It's certainly not enough anymore. So hopefully that kind of paints the picture, for today. So there's a lot of these risks, and how do we go about, figuring out, well, what are, if there's a key credit risk or there's a key, reputation risk or there's a key cyber risk, and then what do we do to monitor that, right? So we're going to jump in, and let's start off with topic definitions. So strategic objectives, and what I mean here, you may not call them strategic objectives, but when you're doing your strategic planning, what we're talking about here is basically, those long-term goals, right? Here's where we're taking the bank in the next year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever your cycle is for planning. in terms of your overall objectives. Sometimes there's 3, 5, maybe up to 10 of those high-level objectives. It's here's where we want to steer the bank. And then that's generally followed up by strategic initiatives, i.e. corporate projects. So here is how management's saying, okay, look, here are the things that we're going to actually do to drive results to these objectives. And so there are risks, obviously, in where you want to go, but the risks are really borne out in how you're going to get there. And that's really where you want to start beginning to have key risk discussions around. Determine, right? Okay, well, what are specific key risks? And a key risk, as I'm defining that today, is basically a risk out of any of those applicable risk categories that if it manifests, that it is so large that it inhibits your ability to achieve that strategic initiative, on time, within budget, which is obviously going to negatively impact your objective, or it simply kills it altogether. Because there are a myriad of risks in anything that we do. The question is what are the true key risks, right? And then, the KPI or the performance indicator, right? The historical measure. We've been using KPIs, for decades, but they are historical, right? It's the measurement of how well we've ran the race up to this point, regardless of what that is, whether that's original term delinquency ratios, or that's investment rate. Doesn't make any difference. It's a historical data point, right? What we're truly trying to get after is that forward-looking data point. So if we determine what these key risks are to strategy, are we able to see early warning signs of this risk materializing before it has the ability to negatively or adversely impact the achievement of our overall objectives? So from topic definitions, I'm going to be talking across these particular areas. So let's define, i.e. basically, strategic risk as a whole. Now, your definition of strategic risk may be just a little bit different, but by and large, for the most part, the consensus is, that you're looking at, current or prospective risk to your earnings or your capital. So if you're quantifying that risk, most of my clients typically look at total capital, but I do have a couple that look at earnings. It's also strategic risk comes from arising from, adverse business decisions. So we're given data to build out strategy, but we just simply make a bad business decision. So, there's strategic risk there. Or we've implemented those decisions improperly. So again, we made a good decision, we just didn't do a very good job in the implementation process of it. Certainly lack of responsiveness to industry changes. You start talking about strategy, that is huge. How are we monitoring changes in our industry that proactively that could have an adverse impact on the strategy that we're actually trying to deliver? It is also a function of the compatibility of your overall strategic goals. A lot of times what I'll see is I'll look at strategic planning, I'll see these strategic goals, but then the projects don't even line up, one for one, or, as an aggregate to those particular strategic goals. And so there's kind of this mismatch. And then ultimately, business strategies develop to achieve those goals. And that's kind of what I was just talking about, is that those corporate projects, if you're doing something and you can't correlate that strategic initiative to ultimately helping you achieve that objective, then you should probably question why you're potentially doing it. Because at the end of the day, everything that we do from a strategic implementation perspective is generally either to enhance existing products, bring on new products, or enhance some sort of infrastructure so that we can bring on, more products or significantly enhance the products that we currently offer. And then ultimately, it's resources that you deploy to accomplish those goals, because it's not just what I see a lot is, hey, we've got the budget, we've got the capital dollars, we could do it. Well, what about, just resources? One of the biggest ones I see for strategic risk of why you're over budget or, you're not getting it done on time is ultimately resource constraint, i.e. the human element, right? We over allocate our human resources to implementing. And then lastly, just the overall quality of your implementation, because a lot of times some projects get more love than other projects. And the question becomes have we even recognized that potentially as a risk itself? So now when we look at, kind of defining, strategic risk management, i.e. we just talked about strategic risk, but what about the management of that risk? That's your process for identifying, assessing, right, and managing all of the risks that we were just kind of talking about that would be applicable to a given aspect of your strategy. It is absolutely affected by internal and external events or scenarios. So it's not just things that are like the internal could be resource constraints, but there may be macroeconomic risks that you need to account for, which would be that that monitoring of events outside of the bank. But good strategic risk management also enhances your ability to achieve your strategy and your overall strategic objectives, because you are going to experience some risk. And so rather than waiting for it to land on your doorstep and negatively impact you, which ends up showing up in how you're measuring your KPIs, because that's historical, you're trying to actually give yourself that cushion, which is what a good KRI does, so that you can make better business decisions. It's the ultimate goal is really creating and protecting shareholder value, because at the end of the day, enterprise risk, as much as it is about preserving the value, there are ways that it also is going to enhance and bring value to the overall strategy for your bank. And then lastly, it is a primary component and a necessary foundation for ERM, because you can't ask risk management to just look at managing the bottom up of the bank, which is just all the operational business processes, understanding what those risks are, understanding what the controls are that we have in place, and not the top down. And what we're talking about today is enterprise risk management for top down strategy risk management. And what that means is that if you implement strategy today, tomorrow it becomes a business process and or set of business processes that have to support it. So you can wait and hopefully maybe find out that those risks have materialized after you've implemented it, and now you're trying to run it on a day-to-day basis operationally, and maybe you might find some of those risks, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll have controls in place that help to mitigate it, maybe you won't. The more proactive that you can be on the front end in the strategy piece, the less impact it's going to have on you operationally as well, which i.e. means, A, I'm going to be more successful in implementing my strategy, and that also means that I am going to put less stress, less pressure on my operations to actually support that once it's implemented inside of the bank. All right, that actually brings us to our very first poll question, which is, does your institution currently document key risks? Not a key risk indicator, but are you documenting the key risks for your strategy? So A, not at all. B, yes, but kind of only high level. There's no direct association. So maybe you just do like a high level SWOT analysis, a strength, weakness, opportunity, threats, but there's no real linkage to specific parts of the strategy. C, yes, but you kind of only really look at those key financial risks that we were kind of talking about earlier on the left side of the screen. Or D, hey, we absolutely document all key risks specific to our strategy. And we'll give you just a second here to kind of put your responses in to the poll, and then I'll have Emily, if you once those kind of come in, if you can kind of let us know kind of where we're shaking out. I'm going to say that based upon a lot of the clients I work with, I'm probably thinking we've got a smattering between B and C.
Yeah, let's just give folks we'll give you guys about 10 more seconds to just get this wrapped up.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Bill, I don't think you're too far off. We'll just give them one more second.
Sure. No, and I appreciate everybody, putting your feedback in, because it's certainly interesting to the discussion, but it's also helps other folks that are on the webinar today to kind of, marry up, if you will, kind of where are they at in that lay of the land as well.
All right, so I think we're going to close this out here, Bill. And we're at 40% with B, the yes but only high level and no direct association. 29% are looking at all key risks, and then we've got 22% looking at only key financial risks.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Well, again, thank you, folks. And again, that makes everybody's at a different maturation level when it comes to talking about key risks around their strategy. But what I would say is the fact that there was that subset we're in D, and that's phenomenal. And that's going to come into a question later in terms of, okay, well, what are we actually doing with that data? But if you're looking only, if you do a high level with no direct association, you've got foundational data that you're going to be able to potentially mature on and assist you as you begin to try to start to develop KRIs into the future. So let's take a quick strategic example. And I was going to pull up, because there's been a handful of I shouldn't say good ones. There's been a handful of them strategic risks examples in our own industry, the financial services industry, within the last few years. And I'm not going to necessarily mention the particular banks, but we all know who they are. But one of the ones that was always interesting to me, which really kind of puts the point on it, is Kodak. I mean, we all know Kodak, but what a lot of people don't realize is Kodak invented, right, digital photography. A lot of people don't even realize that. And what's interesting about it is they invented this. They basically sat it on the shelf. They failed to monitor, right, what their competition was doing. They failed to monitor for industry changes, and Sony and a handful of others came in and basically ate their lunch. It actually was kind of the start of the downfall, if you will, of Kodak for being this powerhouse, right? They're like, oh, nobody's going to want to just look at it in a digital, right? Everybody wants those printed photos. Everybody wants the development of the photos. They couldn't have been any more wrong from a strategic perspective, and they continued year over year to just fail to see those risks that were materializing right in front of them. And to the point to where towards the end, with just a few years ago, they were selling multiple patents that they had just to pay some of the bills. And so when you look at real strategic risk, I mean, you can correlate this back to our own business. Fintech is a big one that everybody is very cognizant of. The question becomes is as we develop strategy, right? Are we talking specifically about some of that fintech risk, and how does it align directly to our strategy, and what can we potentially do to monitor for it so we don't end up basically like Kodak and some of our financial peers. So I like to use the analogy of climbing the mountain when you look at this. And obviously the objective is always to get to the summit. So whatever your objectives or set of objectives are, we always start out here as we are as management. We're sitting down here and we're left to try to figure out, okay, well, what are the strategic initiatives? What are those corporate projects that we're going to develop to basically achieve the objective or the objectives? And the issue becomes, just like with Kodak, just like with some of our peers, failure to see the future generally ends up in some sort of disastrous consequences. And so, when you're looking at developing your strategy, i.e. those corporate projects, right, you're looking for, well, what are some of those key risks? Well, obviously, one of those key risks would be the weather. Now, we're not just looking at what the weather is tomorrow. We're not monitoring for what we are going to look tomorrow, but we're also looking, what is the weather supposed to be next week? What is the weather, 2 weeks out, which is about a lot of times the best that we can get. But nonetheless, we're still monitoring for that into the future, because no matter whether this initiative takes 2 weeks to do, 2 months to do, or 2 years to do, the question becomes are we monitoring appropriately for those particular key risks? And in this case, that weather, I'd be, as the executive owner of this project, that would be one of the key risks that I would absolutely want to be monitoring for. And some of the other things that we would also monitor for would be, what I call the big rocks. Those are, again, a key risk that is, if it manifests, it severely inhibits my ability to achieve my objective or kills it altogether. So if you think about it, right, there's a lot of risks coming down this mountain. There's a tremendous number of risks. And some of those are little pebbles that hit us, if you will, and they sting, but they don't take us off course. It doesn't cost us more time. It doesn't cost us more money. However, failure to monitor for the risks that absolutely do materialize, because maybe when you plotted this course, there wasn't a big giant boulder right here in the way. And are you better off to wait until you get right up on it to realize that your path is blocked? Everybody is backing up behind you. You're trying to figure out, can I go around it? Do I have to go over it? Do I have to blow it up? I can't do anything at all, right? That is a bad place for us strategically as executives to be in. So it would be better for us to be monitoring for that, right? So that I'd rather be talking about and making the decision when I'm in this part of the journey than once I got all the way up here. And so that's really hopefully maybe draws that picture. So when you look at strategic planning, one of the things that we talk about is, strategic objectives, the alignment of strategic initiatives, corporate projects, and we would consider this kind of minimal strategic planning. There might be a SWOT analysis around this, but the question really comes is, are you looking at, here again, this is where I want to go, this is how I'm going to get there. The risks are always borne out in how I'm going to get there. So if we're aligning risk and opportunity directly into those pieces of strategy, okay, well now for those of you that said, hey, we're doing just straight financial, well, you can add in additional key risks from other applicable risk categories. Those of you that are already looking at all of those, hopefully, you've outlined that, and you've also maybe even outlined some potential opportunities that could help you to achieve these pieces of strategy faster, cheaper, right? But ultimately following up with an applicable KRI to help you to monitor, help risk management to help you monitor for the materialization of that particular risk or set of risks. We would then consider this robust strategic planning, where you actually have outlined specific key risks and you are monitoring for those various key risks to your strategy. So one of the things I always like to talk about is leading indicators, right? And COSO has this really good, just kind of this little arrow, this graphic here, if you will, where the risk event, right? Well, that's the key risk, right? That's the rock, that's the weather, that's original term delinquency, that's whatever the risk is that you have determined to that aspect of strategy. That risk just doesn't happen by itself. There is an intermediate event or a set of intermediate events that kind of led up to that event happening. The key here is can you find the root cause? So the further back you can go in understanding what leads up to that risk actually happening, the more time that you have. And to give you a really good example around this, the reason I said original term delinquency is I had a client who was very community-based. That community is very heavy in manufacturing. So as you can imagine, most of the deposits, the lending around it, all coming from the manufacturing or the support of, in effect, that area that comes from the fact that those manufacturing is there. One of the things that they were looking at in their strategy was they were looking at some original term delinquency and as the risk event, right? And the question is like, well, how do you see that? They go, well, we track original term delinquency every month. Okay, but what leads up to that? And one of the things that they were actually able to ascertain was the root cause. And in this case, there was, there's a lot of root causes for it, but for them, there was one where they actually were able to obtain data from on the manufacturing side to know when there was, a lot of overtime, or there was, they were going from 2 shifts to 3 shifts, or they're moving from 3 shifts down to 2 shifts. And what was really interesting was once they actually aggregated some of that historical data, they overlaid the same time period with their original term delinquency charting. And what they found was extremely interesting. they found is that based upon whether they were going from 2 shifts to 3, 3 to 2, they were running 2 shifts and now they were adding overtime or they were taking away overtime. What they started to see actually was about this 4 to 6 month window before they started seeing movement in their original term delinquency, i.e. the risk event. And so for them, it was this huge aha moment to where now they do track that as a KRI because they understand the root cause that, that original term delinquency just doesn't happen tomorrow, right? There is something, there's this intermediate event, there's this root cause event, there's something that's leading up to it. The more that you can drive into this, the more time you're going to give yourself to be able to react, be proactive to what is potentially materializing. So I bring this up because you may start off with, well, here's this key risk. What can we monitor, so we know this is coming? Well, maybe if you only get to the intermediate event, that's still cool, right? That's so maybe that's only gives you a month or 2 months or whatever the case may be, instead of down here being 4 to 6. But then over time, what happens is you actually start to begin to understand a little bit more, and allows you to potentially pull in other different data points that will give you that information. And one of the things that we found interesting about this is the reverse was true, because the economy had been so good for the last couple of years. They were actually seeing this to be that kind of reverse indicator, if you will, right? To where they were seeing the actual loan production or the request for lending going up in direct proportion to how that amount of overtime or the amount of extra, third shift added, if you will, was playing in. So that is what you're trying to do, is get to that root cause. And if you think about it, we do this even with our vendors. If something happens with our vendor that has negatively impacted us, that was the event. We always look at them and say, well, we'd like a root cause analysis. Tell us what led up to the fact that this happened. So, and that in and of itself, if they would have had that in as a KRI, they potentially could have stopped it from happening to us. All right, so let's kind of look at poll question number 2. Does your bank currently develop KRIs for your strategy? So you were developing key risks before, but do you take those key risks and actually develop forward-looking, so not KPIs, but forward-looking metrics to try to help you to see that risk coming? And no, we don't have any metrics tied directly to the strategy. B, no, we only do KPIs, right? C is yes, but we only develop those financial KRIs. And then D would be yes, we are developing monitoring all KRIs. And for all KRIs, that would be all applicable key risks where you're able to ascertain and develop an appropriate monitoring of that risk. So interesting to see where everybody falls now, based upon the fact that we had a lion's share at B before, and then kind of split 2020 on C and D. So that'll be very interesting to see how we come across there.
Yeah, but we're seeing a couple of strong inclinations. So we'll try to give it, say, another 15, 20 seconds or so.
Okay.
For our attendees, just remember to hit that vote button, so it will take your response to the poll. Absolutely,
and please jump right in there, even if you're not looking for continuing credits. Certainly would love to get your feedback where you're at.
All right, let's give it about 10 more seconds. We'll close it up. So get in your votes.
All right, get them in. Because we're about 34 minutes in already, and so I think we're making good time.
All right, so I think we are ready to wrap this up. Bill, what we're looking at is 38% saying yes, but only key financial risk indicators. 34% are only using KPIs, and then we've got 20% that develop and monitor all key risk indicators.
Very good, and that would be pretty much. I probably would have almost would have guessed that based upon the previous polling question, and that's so if you're only doing KPIs, again, you had indicated that you were kind of outlining some key risks. The good thing now is, you've got some data that you can, move forward with. And for the folks that had C, just the financial risk, and that makes sense with a lot of my clients initially because it's something that is we're so in tune to, again, because we were looking at credit, interest rate, liquidity risk, so on and so forth, and a lot of that is born out of our ALCO meetings, and so one of the things is again going back to that whole scope of picture is trying to really understand, well, what are those key risks in those other areas? Because if all we're monitoring for is just the financial, which we absolutely need to, there are certainly other aspects of key risks that could materialize. And what happens is I always hear this, well, it was a black swan. No, it wasn't a black swan, right? Because you technically, if we would have actually even just kind of talked about it, we could have even probably gotten around the edges on it. So thank you, everyone, for your feedback, because that's what it sounds like to me is that we've got some folks that are definitely on pace for further maturation, and then others that are definitely looking to where they can continue, but they can also potentially improve as well. So let's give you a couple of examples here real quick. This is actually one of the clients that I have worked with in the past. One of the objectives taken right out of their strategic planning document was increase non-interest income by a certain percent without raising fees. Well, who doesn't want more non-interest income, right? And so, obviously, okay, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to do that? And their specific initiative was they were going to promote their overdraft programs. And it was really interesting because when they started outlining and looking at all applicable, key risks, one of the risks that they came up with was untrained staff don't present the benefits fairly, and it's seen as predatory by their auditors and or their regulators. And what was interesting about this key risk was when this strategy was first floated, it almost got shot down because a few years earlier, they had kind of been warned about how they were kind of doing their overdraft program. So they were a little skittish, but it was clearly for them, it was a key risk. So they looked at this risk and they said, okay, well, what's the KRI? Well, they're going to do monthly tracking of trained and tested employees. And so when you look at what kind of makes up in its totality that, that overall KRI, it's got a few characteristics. So using this example, well, you've got the name of it because, you're going to report it. I mean, it seems, fairly simplistic, but it is. And then there's the description, right? So at least it needs to be descriptive enough of, in this case, they're going to track all of the employees who communicate the overdraft to their consumers from their branch, their call centers, their business development staff. So again, that's the scope. The measurement is the last training date and the test score. The frequency was 30 days. And then there was the measurement owner. Now, this is not the executive owner who owns the risk, who owns the project, who owns the KRI. This is the person who acquires the data and provides it to risk management for the monitoring of the KRI. So in this case, it's HR training because they're the ones that do it, right? Trigger limits, last training or testing date exceeds 6 months or the score is below 90%. That is when, that's when the KRI is going to trigger. That's, if it's within these tolerances, we're good. But as soon as it triggers, that's when risk management is going to bring that for discussion. What is the escalation procedure if that happens? This doesn't have to be war and peace, but there should be some thought given to, well, wait a minute, if this thing triggers, if this risk is starting to materialize, it's not here yet, but if it's starting to materialize, what the heck would we do? We don't have to have a full-fledged remediation plan, but we should at least have an understanding of what we're going to or may be able to do. And then lastly, who is the risk owner? And in this case, it's the COO. That individual owned the corporate project, and but they aren't, again, they're not the measurement owner. So that kind of gives you an idea. You got those 8 kind of base level things. Now, there are some other details potentially to look at, but you absolutely have to have these kind of high level things in place. So let's look at one more. Increase efficiency. I see this like in almost everybody's strategic planning. So it's like, well, in this case, what are you going to do to increase efficiency? Well, they were going to reduce mortgage SLA turn times. because for them, they had they've got a huge amount of mortgage volume. And so they looked at this and said, well, what would be one of the specific risks? Well, that was reduction in their personnel or new employees. Now, they had very seasoned staff. They were fully staffed. But what they realized is that in the environment that we've had within the last couple of years, because this is really only about 24 months old, they realized that they were getting a lot of employees that were being stolen away by mortgage brokers and various other institutions. And so that was a key concern for them. A key risk for them was that if they had reduction in personnel or new employees, that there was going to potentially be a risk in mortgage SLA, which is a huge part of their strategy and also increasing their efficiency. So they said their KRI was going to be weekly tracking of mortgage SLAs. Now, you probably already track mortgage stages, potentially. The question becomes is how does that tie back to specific risk that ties back into strategy? Or is this just at an operational level? Because even at an operational level, it has an impact ultimately on the strategy if there is this correlation. So in their particular instance, right, they had, again, the name, the description, and this covered their application process, processing, underwriting, their pre and post close, as well as their funding. The measurement was they were going to measure those turn times at each stage. They were going to do it weekly. So the person that owned that was the mortgage department management team. They were turning in that information weekly. Now, everybody asked me about, well, should it be weekly? Should it be monthly? Should it be quarterly? What should it be? And it really just depends on the risk and how fast that risk, can actually materialize. So in their case, weekly, because they had the data, it wasn't cumbersome, it made sense to them. And for them, their trigger was turn times that exceeded each stage, by 10%. That was how they determined it. And then their escalation procedure was not immediately they were going to, that something had to be done. There was going to be a review by the management. They were going to have potential remediation by the mortgage lending supervisor, and then ultimately take that data and hand it to whom? To their chief lending officer, because their CLO was the executive owner of that part of the strategy. Again, didn't own the data, but owned the overall risk and the KRI that it is tied to into the strategy that they are the subject matter expert around. So that is in a nutshell what you want to look at from that standpoint. But you can also look at it from the standpoint of that reverse key indicator, right? The opportunity. How can you're like, how can a KRI, it cuts both ways potentially. So in this particular instance, had a client who wanted to increase market presence. And they said, well, we're going to do that through targeted advertising via all medium forms. They had two counties. They didn't have any branches in, but they wanted to do business in. And they said, look, we've got to get increased market presence there before we could justify building a branch. So they said, we're going to target this. They had a marketing budget. It was everything. It was print, social media, billboard, radio, you name it. And they said, well, they went through and they talked about what some of the key risks were and developed some KRIs, but they also looked at this and said, well, what's the opportunity? How would we see opportunity actually that could help us with this? And so they were tracking their competitors, and you guys are tracking raising and lowering of deposits. Now, for them, it was kind of more of a micro view because they were looking just specifically in these two counties that they were trying to achieve this objective in, right? And then what they said is they were going to track competitors in that targeted geographic footprint. Now, what was interesting about this was they were doing this, and after about 4 to 5 months, because they were polling kind of the person on the street, if you will, hey, do you know who we are? And that what they were finding out is that they were pretty successful in blanketing, right? Most of the people that they were polling knew who they were. And so the question became, they were like, we've realized this opportunity. Do we just continue for another 8 months because we budgeted the money? No, actually what they did was they made a decision that they were going to continue to kind of drip this in, but at the same time, they started looking because they couldn't afford, they hadn't budgeted for a branch at that moment. But what they were able to find was they were actually able to find an existing location in one of those counties that they were able to lease and basically put their name right out on the front of it. And they took some of that marketing budget to basically just say, hey, now we're here, boom. And they allocated the remainder of it, some into other strategic areas, and some of it, was very specific to the county that they had just leased that building in. So they would not have really understood that opportunity had they not actually been monitoring for it. If it would have just been, oh, hey, how does this, we're just out here spending money and advertising, and this is really trying to quantify how that opportunity shook out to help them. So it is equally, now, people ask me, well, every single time, is there going to be an equal opportunity for every single KRI? Is there a yin for the yang? And there may be, but maybe there won't be, or maybe you realize it a little bit into the deployment of your strategy. There's no right or wrong there, but if you don't at least ask the question when you're building the strategy, what is the reputational risk? What is the strategic opportunity that would help us to achieve this objective, under budget, ahead of time, or could, make it even better than what we had imagined in the beginning? Sometimes that happens at development of the strategy, and sometimes it happens a little bit later, but at least if you plant that seed, this information is better, a couple months, implemented a couple months after than just never at all. So given that we've talked KRIs for, the monitoring of risk and potentially opportunity, that brings us to our third and final poll question, which is based upon the information today, what you're currently doing today, are you going to at least consider changes to your current key indicator development and monitoring process? So A, no, our current process is very robust. That might be some of the folks that were answering, DD in the two previous poll questions, because maybe they feel that they're fully mature in that aspect. Or B, you're going to, discuss it with the executive team, take some of these concepts and say, hey, can we improve that process? C, yeah, we're going to, begin developing more, financial KRIs. Or D, yes, we're going to develop all applicable KRIs to our strategy. So I'm interested in this one, and I don't know. I'm not even going to venture a guess, Emily, on this one.
All right. I can give you a hint. I think we're seeing a lot of proactive considerations, but we'll keep running this maybe about 15 more seconds.
Sure.
So get your vote in, guys. Make
Please.
sure to hit that vote button as well, so we get your response.
And interestingly enough, when you look at this, what I would also say is, for those of you that are, if you're looking already at all applicable key risks and you're developing applicable KRIs, the question that I always ask when I look at your strategy, your strategic planning, your strategic initiatives, the budgetary aspect of it, the KPIs and the KRIs you're developed is, are you developing or at least having the discussion around specifically, are there any opportunities that we would want to monitor for that would come out of this strategy that would assist us? Because for those that are very mature in creating all applicable KRIs, that is one place that we do see that there's additional maturation that can occur, is in the development of, in effect, that key opportunity indicator, if you will.
All right, well, Bill, we're going to close this up, and we've got
Okay.
57% that said they're going to discuss with the executive team how to make improvements. Roughly a quarter that are going to develop an all KRIs kind of approach. 18% are going to be looking more at financial KRIs, and just 1% believe that they won't make any changes. So a lot of changes.
Yeah. So, well, and that's good. And what that means is that, hopefully you guys have, good change management processes in place to help you as you kind of walk through, figuring out, well, what are we going to do? And I know, everybody has different strategic planning sessions, cycles and whatnot. But one of the things that I would tell you is, when you look at those overall objectives, and a lot of times objectives don't change dramatically year over year. I mean, a lot of my clients I look at they'll have a 3-year vision with, like a 5-year stretch vision, if you will. around those objectives. It's really those annual budgetary projects, the strategic initiatives that obviously change year over year. But that's where you want to really start to have that discussion, right? Is that, hey, we're doing, we want to do this corporate project. It's not just, hey, can we afford it, right? I mean, we know we can afford it. We've been doing that for years. The question becomes is okay, well, is there is there a key reputational risk? Is there a key cyber risk? Is there a key transactional fraud error risk? Because what happens a lot of times is that when you understand, if you think back to that first slide, when you understand and fold in those additional applicable key risks on the right side of the screen, not just the financial risks that were on the left side of the screen, you fold that in its totality, I've actually seen it to where the budgetary aspect of that project has gone up. The ROI is not as effective anymore. Why? Because now those risks existed all along. It's just we didn't talk about them, right? So now we understand them. And the question may be is, you know what, hey, we're okay with that risk. We're going to monitor for it. But you know what? Part of this project, we're going to put some controls into place, whatever those are. Those could be existing controls. Those, we could enhance existing controls, or it might be new controls to help to mitigate that risk happening as we implement strategy and put it into the bank. And if by doing that, ROI, that doesn't mean that you're not going to do the project. It just means that you actually have a better level set understanding of really what is the true ROI for this. And because if you don't have enough resources, and I see that all the time, resource constraint that I talked about earlier, with resource constraint, that's huge. Because that does cost more money. I don't have enough people. I mean, unless we're going to make people work 80 hours a week. I've actually seen that in corporate projects, and that is a resource risk. So that's one risk that a lot of times doesn't even get touched. And on that actually brings us into the Q&A, and hopefully there was some questions coming in. That gives us about 8-9 minutes, which I think is about right where we were supposed to be, hopefully. So
yeah.
Did we have some coming in, Emily?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you do still have questions for Bill, there is still time to get those in. So don't feel like the end of the presentation means you can't submit any more questions. But Bill, the first one we've got is a pretty quick one. An attendee asked, could you please define original term delinquency?
Well, defining original term delinquency, right? I mean, typically for a lot of my clients, it's original term delinquency beyond that 30-day, right? So anything past the, once it goes 1 month delinquent. And so in the example that I was using, that's what they were looking at, is they were saying anything that is basically going further than 1 month delinquent, that was the specific risk that they were trying to basically monitor for.
Perfect. Here is another one. It reads, we don't currently create KRIs for our institution, but we want to. What is the appropriate number for a typical strategy?
I get that a lot. And, you hate to say it depends, but it does, right? Because it just depends on, well, how many corporate projects do you have? What specifically are those key risks? So one of the things I tell folks is it really, make sure that you always define, kind of like that's what I like to do in the beginning, is define what the key risk actually means to you. And so, is it truly a key risk instead of just it basically being a risk? So one of the things that you kind of think, if you kind of do a mind mapping, is you're sitting here looking at this corporate project, and you just should go through. You should go through start off by going through the applicable risk categories, whether you've got 8, 10, risk categories. Hey, does it have credit risk? Key credit risk, yes or no? Okay, boom, here's what that would be. Does it have, key compliance risk or transaction risk or strategic risk or liquidity, whatever, right? And you end up with kind of like this list, and then it's like, well, do I have resource constraint risk? Do I have, do I have any other types of risks that I want to fold in around this specific given process or project? And then, maybe you've got a list of 15 risks. Then what you can do from there is say, hey, here is what's the number, what is the one I'm most concerned about, and kind of work your way down. And what I will tell people is there is no magic number, but what I usually see is it needs to be a manageable number. You don't want so many that you don't see the forest for the trees. And that's why the definition of how you define key risk is critical. But most of the time I will see on a given project, usually, one, no more than three. Because you really got to start questioning, if this risk materializes, does it, kill the project altogether or severely inhibit our ability to achieve it? And that's kind of how you try to whittle it down. So hopefully that answers the question, because I can't really say that, there's one or there's three or there's 10 or whatever. But if you use that kind of thought process and framework as you outline and talk about risks that are key risks to your strategy, hopefully that will help you to drive further into defining what really truly is.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Bill, given the uncertainties in the current environment, does that shift how banks should look at KRIs?
Absolutely, and I would imagine a lot of folks on this call are sitting here, either they've reforecasted, thought about reforecasting, they've thought about changing their strategy, and what I would tell you is absolutely is, look at, we are experiencing some new risks now that we hadn't experienced before. Now, the question becomes is if this continues, well, what does the understanding of the materialization of that risk mean to our strategy? And to give you a real quick example, we're working with a client, and I've just had calls with them within the last couple months, and they initially, they had their strategy, and it was 2020 through 2022, and at the end of 2022, they were actually thinking about they're busting at the seams in their HQ, and they were thinking about actually building a brand new, very large headquarters that has all, it's got all the back office, so everything, typically not found inside of your branches. So, collections and IT and, accounting and risk management, so on and so forth, and call centers and all that. And what now they've realized is they actually have reevaluated their strategy. And it's very interesting because 90% of their employees are working remote, which I would imagine for you guys probably have a lion's share of that. I know a lot of people, depending on the states that you're in, some of their branches are back open, some are still by appointment only, whatever the case may be. But those back office folks, a lot of those folks are still working remote. And so for them, when they looked at their strategy of building this building at the end of 2022, they looked at it and said, you know what, we have about 30% of the business processes in our business that we're comfortable now, doing remote. We're still servicing the customer. Now, there are some additional risks and potentially some additional controls or existing controls that need to be looked at from an operational perspective to help reduce that operational risk. However, what they've realized is in their strategy is they're saying, you know what, we're changing the strategy. We're not, because if we reduce 30% and those stay remote, so they're talking about 30% of their workforce literally not coming back. And then they looked at, well, what would be the risks around doing that? And we talked about those risks, and one of those risks was the fact that, well, there might be some employees that aren't happy about that. And so they looked at the specific business processes in that strategy that work in the facility, and then they said, okay, they polled those individuals to find out, well, who was comfortable, who was not comfortable, and what they've deemed now is about 30% will continue to work remote, which dramatically changes that long-term vision of their strategy. And now they're making that change to their strategy. They're not going to be building that brand new building. They're pretty comfortable that building is going to at least house them for about the next 5 years. They're thinking now that they may actually take some of that money that they were actually going to, from the budgetary, from a capital perspective, and potentially build a new branch where they had been wanting to, but they were holding off on it because they needed to basically, upsize their HQ, if that makes sense. So yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Well, with that, Bill, I think that's a great way to close this webinar out. So to our audience, as a reminder, You will receive the recorded version of this webinar within 24 hours. We'll also post this webinar on both bankdirector.com and on quantivate.com. And I want to thank Bill and Quantivate for co-hosting today's webinar. And thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.